Hello and welcome to the Classic Hollywood Movie You Should Know. I'm Nate Washburn. This week the movie is from 1942, Mrs. Miniver, starring Greer Garson, Walter Pidgeon, and Teresa Wright, directed by William Wyler. Now this movie has a pretty sort of simple storyline. It tells the story of Kay Miniver, played by Greer Garson, and her husband Clem Miniver, played by Walter Pidgeon. The story is set in England, and it begins in summer of 1939, just before the war began, before World War II began, before Germany invaded Poland, and it goes through the first several months of the war and shows sort of how it affects this one family in this tiny village in England. And the Minivers see the war up close because their village is located near an airfield, and their eldest son, Vin, enlists in the RAF, and he takes part in sort of the defense of England as the Germans are bombing these areas in the beginning months of the war. And what really impressed me with this movie's fantastic. What really impressed me is the way that director William Wyler handles the war itself and sort of the action sequences, the battle sequences. I almost think it should be required viewing for filmmakers today because he does these things, and in the script it talks about, there's the town gets bombed and the Miniver's house gets bombed, and yet you never see that. What happens is Kay and Clem, with their two youngest kids, are in a bomb shelter, and they are there reading Alice in Wonderland as this massive bombardment of their town occurs. And it's a very claustrophobic scene. The whole bomb shelter is shaking, and you just see the fear and concern in Kay and Clem's eyes as they're trying to protect their kids, and yet you never see sort of the town in flames. You don't see all the bombs going off. You don't see the explosions, and yet it is one of the most tense, most interesting ways of doing a battle sequence that I've ever seen. Now, the performances in this movie are top-notch. This film got 5 acting nominations at the Oscars. Greer Garson got nominated, Teresa Wright got nominated as Best Supporting Actress, Dame Mae Whitty was also nominated as Best Supporting Actress, Walter Pidgeon was nominated as Best Actor, and Henry Travers was nominated as Best Supporting Actor. It's a record. It has been tied by a few other films. Bonnie and Clyde, Network, From Here to Eternity, and Mrs. Miniver are the only 4 films to have received 5 acting nominations. Now, Mrs. Miniver was released on June 4th of 1942, and why that's important, 1942 was a tough year in the war. The Germans were actually still on the offensive. The Battle of Stalingrad, which is the turning point in the European theater, didn't begin until August of 1942. So this movie came out before the Germans were stopped at Stalingrad. They were still on the move. The outcome of the war was still up in the air. And so to do a movie like Mrs. Miniver, it's so touching and so moving and so important. In fact, the last scene, there's a sermon delivered by the actor named Henry Wilcoxon. It sort of just ties everything together and talks about how this war needs to be fought by everyone. From the people at home to the soldiers on the front line to the politicians, everyone needs to be involved. And it's this incredibly moving, touching speech. It's gone down in history as the Wilcoxon speech. It was reprinted in Time magazine and Look magazine. FDR singled it out as a great work. Leaflets were printed with parts of the speech. They were dropped over occupied Europe. And Churchill was even quoted as saying, "This film did more for the British war effort than a whole flotilla of destroyers." That's how important this movie was to Churchill and to the British people. It was the highest grossing film of 1942. Again, it had those 5 Oscar nominations for the acting performances, but it had 12 total Oscar nominations. It won 6, including Best Picture, Best Director for William Wyler, Best Actress for Greer Garson, and Best Supporting Actress for Teresa Wright. And a light note to end it on, a little bit of trivia. After filming completed, Greer Garson, who plays Kay, and Richard Ney, who plays Vin, her son in the movie, those two got married in real life. So if you are a fan of great dramatic movies, if you like war movies, if you're interested in World War II, I highly recommend watching Mrs. Miniver from 1942. It is touching, it's moving, it's suspenseful. It's just a really, really well done movie. Highly recommend it, and it is this week's Classic Hollywood Movie You Should Know. I'm Nate Washburn. Keep watching.